The ideas that were put into practice in the 1930s didn't come out of nowhere.
Frances Perkins told FDR she would only become his Secretary of Labor if he would agree to allow her to try to make things happen.
People are consciously going into the administration because they want to make a difference in the world.
What she accomplished is really extraordinary.
And I was inspired by that.
This is American Compassion, the Safety Net podcast, a series devoted to telling the story of the safety net, governmental and not, in America. I'm Michael Zapruder.
And I'm Rebecca McEnroy. This podcast tells the story behind the story of the American safety net, the story of those who had the vision, those who continued the vision, and at least one man who is developing and expanding the vision into the 21st century and beyond.
At the LBJ school, you sort of elect your commencement speaker. And I wanted to do it, but I didn't tell a soul that I wanted to be the commencement speaker. And they had tryouts a month or so before graduation. And I went to the tryouts and did it in the auditorium under the library. And I was elected the commencement speaker.
I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak today. This group really does come from across the globe. Everywhere from North Dakota to Western New York, from Mexico City to Seoul, and our beliefs about the world and the way it should be span at least as far and wide. And although we are a diverse group of kids, there's something deep inside us that ties us all together. That something was our choice to come here to this school at this time in our lives.
My name is Erine Gray. This is one of the best days of my life, actually. And it was about 9/11. It was about being that class of the LBJ school that were the first responders of public policy.
For me, the decision process began when I was staffed on a software project. I flew into New York City on a late Monday night, and the next day I found myself standing on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, witnessing what the whole world witnessed. And shortly afterwards, when I got to my company's office that was in Midtown, a few miles north, I found out that the client that I was in town to do work for had their offices on the 92nd, 99th, and 100th floors of the South Tower. And I remember how I felt that day. And to be honest, I never felt more helpless in all my life. And that's when I started thinking about doing something different with my career. But my story's not all that unique. More than a few of us are here as a result. We all had a renewed sense of urgency. We knew that what we're about to do is extremely important, no matter what side of the political fence we're on. And in the months that followed, every one of us applied to this school. This is the first graduating class that's entered this school after that day.
I think what I learned is that good government is not partisan while I was at the LBJ school, where you just had dorky people caring about the details. People that go into government aren't really partisans. People that go into politics are partisans. And I didn't know the separation, I guess I would say. I learned that people are consciously going into the administration because they want to make a difference in the world. And they want to be in the messiness of the intersection between politics and public policy. And I was inspired by that.
Erine has gone on to be in the messiness, for sure, advocating for the underserved, founding Findhelp.org, and continuing to work to reimagine and rebuild the American safety net. But he wasn't the first one to find himself witnessing a horrific event on the streets of New York City and vowing to make a difference. About 90 years earlier, and about 2 miles north of where Erine stood on 9/11, Frances Perkins looked up.
The upper floors of a factory building that employed hundreds of young people, mostly young immigrant women, had caught on fire. And Frances Perkins and her friends ran across Washington Square and got there as the first women began jumping out of the windows to their death.
Kirstin Downey is a writer and journalist and author of Frances Perkins, the woman behind the New Deal.
So she was a witness to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire.
Frances Perkins.
The accident happened on a Saturday. I happened to have been visiting a friend on the other side of the park, and we heard the engines and we heard the screams and rushed out and rushed over where we could see the trouble was. We could see this building from Washington Square, and the people had just begun to jump when we got there. They'd been holding until that time, standing in the windowsills, being crowded by others behind them, and the fire pressing closer and closer, the smoke closer and closer. Finally, the men were trying to put up a net to catch people if they do jump. And they were trying to get that out, and they couldn't wait any longer. I mean, they began to jump. The net broke, and they would jump, and they hit the sidewalk. The weight of the bodies was so great at the speed at which they were traveling that they broke through the net. And every one of them was killed. Everybody who jumped was killed. And it was a horrifying spectacle.
Frances Perkins was the New York director of a group called the National Consumers League, which is still active in Washington today, a group that tries to highlight workplace conditions and help consumers to understand the conditions under which the products that they buy are made or delivered to them. And so she was already studying the New York workplace in that job. She already knew about how crowded the workplaces were, the poor ventilation, the fire safety hazards. Now, she already had been aware of the problem, so she understood the background of the issue. But then she was at an event that horrified people and galvanized action. Now, bad things can happen at any time. And often there's an immediate and early shock where people go, oh, that's terrible, this is really awful, we should do something about it. But frequently nothing happens. What was different is that that particular witness who was there was Frances Perkins. She was ready to go. She mobilized resources. A friend of hers reached out to a very influential politician, one Teddy Roosevelt, who had just stepped down as president, and approached him about sharing something called the Committee on Safety. Teddy Roosevelt said he was too busy to do it. He was about to run for president again, but he suggested that they name Frances Perkins director of the Committee on Safety. Now, she didn't have the official title in a way that you might think. It was necessary back then, before women had the right to vote, for women to take a more behind-the-scenes approach. So what Frances Perkins did is she organized and staged managed a series of hearings that moved all over the state of New York that focused attention on all kinds of workplace problems. And out of that set of hearings examining these issues, a raft of legislation was passed. And from that was the creation of what we call the Fire Safety Code. It's become the International Fire Safety Code. And from that action in New York through the New York State Factory Investigating Committee, Frances Perkins crafted the legislation that has saved millions of lives ever since. The things that we all understand now, like occupancy limits, that you can only have so many people. If it's too crowded, it's dangerous. That you need to know where your fire exits are. That you need to have water sprinklers overhead that can put out a fire. That you need to go every night and collect the flammable trash and throw it away. A lot of people think that's just like a matter of keeping things tidy. It does keep things tidy, but it's also a way that we prevent fires. This was all the Fire Safety Code that Frances Perkins drafted. Then she gave a very important speech on this topic to fire chiefs at one of their national conventions, and then from there, the knowledge went globally to prevent these kinds of terrible industrial fires. And she was 31 years old.
So, in some ways, Frances Perkins wasn't just a witness to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. She was ready to act in that moment to make a change that would not only involve galvanizing the public, but those in government as well around workplace safety. But these first forays into changing workplace policy were also part of a larger plan, a bigger vision to develop a safety net. And she wasn't alone.
There are groups that are thinking about what can government do along these lines.
H.W. Brands is a historian and biographer whose work covers not only the people behind the American safety net, like Theodore Roosevelt and FDR, but in some ways, his work also traces the history of the American consciousness and follows the stories behind the story of America today.
So Theodore Roosevelt, when he ran for president in 1912 on the ticket of the Progressive Party, floated the idea of some kind of social security system. And it included, maybe, healthcare. Now, it's really important to keep in mind when we talk about healthcare in the 1900s and the 1910s, what they're talking about is something very modest, because medicine didn't cost much. There wasn't much that doctors could do. There were no medications to speak of. It was a very modest thing. But Roosevelt had been in favor of industrial accident insurance. This is, in fact, where it first connects with the lives of individuals. There were alarming numbers of people who were injured on the job, and there was nothing in the way of disability insurance. And so if you had your leg cut off in an accident in a coal mine, well, probably, you're going to lose your leg, and maybe there's nobody there to help you pay for the surgery, but the surgery consists of getting your leg cut off, and it didn't take long. That wasn't the expense, but the question was, how are you going to support your family? Because the companies had no obligation, and so you're left without work. So what do? Here's a person who was really a casualty of the Industrial Revolution, found himself in a position where he could no longer support his family. It wasn't his fault. It's not like he was a drunkard or something like that, but this happened. And the question was, how do we deal with this? I mean, one possibility was, let's try to undo the Industrial Revolution. It was at least something you could think about, but even those people who thought about it, we don't want to do that because we like all the advantages of the Industrial Revolution. But we need to somehow spread the risk and spread the cost for those people who do suffer as a consequence of this. And so people like Roosevelt, this is Theodore Roosevelt, would say, all right, we want the benefits of industrialization, but somebody's going to have to pay the cost. We shouldn't put all the costs, for example, of accidents on the shoulders of those relatively few people, more than anybody liked, but comparatively few, who have the misfortune of suffering. So let's set up this disability insurance scheme. And this was part of what Social Security was about.
So Social Security and the safety net in general were ideas that people like Theodore Roosevelt and Frances Perkins were thinking about and working toward back in the early 1900s. But in some ways, and for some people, life was too good to spend time preparing for when times could be or would be bad. The 20s were roaring ahead, and there wasn't yet a concerted effort to develop an all-encompassing safety net. But visionaries like Frances Perkins kept working.
By the time Social Security is actually passed in the 1930s, it has a specific meaning, and most people, when they think of Social Security, think of old age pensions. But in fact, it meant unemployment insurance. And this is another big thing. Unemployment insurance. The idea had been kicking around for decades, but it didn't really catch on until the 1930s. So we should make sure that we note the break between, let's say, 1929 and the stuff before and everything that came after. The ideas that were put into practice in the 1930s didn't come out of nowhere. People had been talking about this, but they weren't getting much traction. If anything, they lost ground during the 1920s. The 1920s was something of a conservative restoration after 2 decades of progressive reforms, mostly about setting up the regulatory state. The idea that government can regulate railroads, the government can regulate monopolies, the government can do this and that. It's very much less at this point about providing social services and incomes and a safety net. But there are those who say, that should be part of it. But that was farther than most Americans were willing to go, because there was still the idea that even Americans of modest means, even poor Americans, clung to that this is the land of opportunity and that we're not going to be poor people forever. And so don't fence us around with all these regulations, because the downside of regulations is they limit opportunity. So we'll take our chances. And this especially applied to immigrants, because they took the biggest chance of all. They left wherever they were born and came to America. And for most of them, they weren't looking for help. They just wanted people to stay out of their way. because they came from countries where government had this overweening power and was always telling people what to do. So most of them are willing to say, I'll take my chances, just give me those chances.
But Frances Perkins knew that not all chances were equal, that even in the land of opportunity, not everyone had the same access to that opportunity, that women, children, the elderly, all had to reap misfortune, but not all enjoyed the same benefits. And she wanted to make things better, more humane, more American, perhaps?
I believe that Frances Perkins was a remarkable social worker who became the most important and effective progressive politician, man or woman, in American history.
Again, Kirstin Downey.
My name is Kirstin Downey. I'm a book author and a journalist. I was a reporter at the Washington Post for 20 years. I never heard the name Frances Perkins until I was 30 and had just come to Washington, D.C., and actually heard her name for the first time when I did the tour bus tour of the monuments of Washington, and we passed the Frances Perkins Department of Labor. And I was really intrigued because it was a Frances with an E. I went, oh my goodness, there's actually something here that's named after a woman. But I had no idea what she'd done. So I was a reporter at the Washington Post for 20 years. I was mainly a business reporter. I covered economics and how the economy affects regular people. During the years that I worked, I started to notice how often I was coming across Frances Perkins' name like a distant echo. I'd done a full interview on an issue, whether it was unemployment insurance or Social Security or workplace fires or any of the kinds of things that it could be, where I would be talking about, well, what's the history of this issue, to sort of give the little bit of context. I was startled to notice how many people who were very old would mention Frances Perkins had played a pivotal role in that issue. And then it was very weird because it wasn't anything I ever heard anybody talk about who was a contemporary of mine. Only old people talked about it, or people who had seen historic references. She was disappearing from public memory. Over the 20 years I was at the Post, I became increasingly aware of Frances Perkins and the unique role she had played in American history in accomplishing so very much of the kinds of things that our country has had a very hard time doing over the last 250 years.
But what made her such an integral part of the American safety net? I mean, who was she? What did she do? And why don't we know anything about her today?
Frances Perkins was born in 1880, so she's a product of the early progressive movement, rather than you might even say the New Deal. The New Deal is the flowering of everything that had been developed during the early progressive era. She said that she could have gone either way. She could have been a progressive Republican or she could have been a Democrat, but she ended up becoming a Democrat. And it's really important for us to remember that there were very important progressive Republicans, including Teddy Roosevelt, who laid the foundation for what later became the New Deal. She was middle class. She came from a family with very old roots in America. And that meant that she understood the economic history of America very well. She understood its booms and bust cycles, when there'd been prosperity, when there'd been poverty. These were things that she understood through her own family and through her own family stories. She did manage to go to college. She went to Mount Holyoke, which was a very good women's college that was preparing people for lives of public service, as in a way they continue to do today. She was one of only tiny percentage of women at that time that was college educated. She became a social worker, which was an opening new field, and she did her graduate work at Columbia, which is what brought her to New York. She married in 1913. She was happily married, but it quickly became apparent that her husband had bipolar disorder, and she became aware that she would have to support the family herself. She worked for a year at something called the Maternity Center Association, where they were investigating and looking into problems of the high maternal death rate and high death rate of babies in America. And so they employed nurses that were back from the First World War. They trained them in maternity care, and she directed and expanded a network of clinics providing this care in marginalized neighborhoods all over New York. From there, it led to an expansion of an awareness of ways to save mothers and babies that spread all over the country. She arrived in New York at a time of a lot of intellectual ferment. There was a great gathering of all kinds of people brought from all over the country. The United States was becoming increasingly prosperous, more of a global power. And there was a lot of artistic and political and literary excitement. One of her closest friends was Sinclair Lewis, the writer who was chronicling and caricaturing the crass nature of American capitalism. She was also friendly with Upton Sinclair. After she graduated from Mount Holyoke and before she moved to New York, she actually lived at Hull House with Jane Addams and was considered part of the settlement house movement. And of course, Upton Sinclair wrote his masterpiece, The Jungle, based on the guidance he received from the women at Hull House who had told him where to go and who to talk to get a really good picture of what was happening in America's slaughterhouses. Along with Robert Moses, there were a group of people that started to have a sense that they could change America for the better by getting into positions of government responsibility, staying there and building on their achievements. She knew Robert Moses well. She was the one who identified him, even when they were both very young, as someone of enormous potential. And this is something that was part of Frances Perkins' unique genius. She also recognized a young Al Smith as having enormous potential. She recognized a young FDR.
She didn't just recognize Franklin Roosevelt. From the first time they met until he died, they had a relationship that not only served them, but was a crucial connection that has repercussions to this day.
It was almost like she was his big sister. And one of the things that's very interesting is she was 2 years older than he was. But somewhere along the line, she started pretending she was his age. And she started telling people that she had the same birth year that he did, which I've always thought was very interesting. But I always felt that she sort of viewed him as you do someone that you've known a very long time and that you feel enormous affection for, and that you see their weaknesses, but you see the way they're great. I think in a lot of ways she was FDR's true best friend. Everyone else who was around him had something else they were looking to get. Anything that happened to her and her relationship with him, she knew that she was never going to get any higher. There was no place else she could go. There was no other office she could run for. She was never going to be president. And she set out to be the best Secretary of Labor to him that she could be. They were both about 30 when they met. He was a young state senator and she was a young lobbyist and campaigner for better workplace conditions, particularly for women and children who made up a lot of the workforce in New York and around the United States, around the world then. So she was advocating for better working conditions. And she recollected later the first time she saw him. He was very tall and handsome, and he had sort of a arrogant way of putting his head back and looking down at people as he talked to them. And she said that he showed no interest in the humanitarian legislation she was proposing at that time. He was a good government advocate, not to say he was doing anything wrong. It's just that he was not on her wavelength at all. And then she said the thing that really changed him was his terrible bout of illness, and that left him severely handicapped. She said that he had suffered so badly through that and nearly died that it made him a kinder person and a person more interested in helping the unfortunates than he had indicated that he would have been in his earlier life. So her early relationship with him is she knew him in that before era when he was this great, handsome, godlike fellow, and their friendship grew and developed in the years that he was a physically broken man. And then as he recovered and found his way as governor of New York, he trusted her very much. She'd been an industrial commissioner under his predecessor, New York Governor Al Smith. And Roosevelt made her the industrial commissioner, so he gave her the top job in the industrial commission. So she worked with FDR for the years when he was governor, and so when he was elected president in 1932, in a sense it was only natural that he would bring along this person who had been a trusted advisor and helper to him during his years in New York.
You're listening to American Compassion, the Safety Net podcast. I'm Rebecca McEnroy. Still ahead.
More than a third of Americans last year got their bread, kept a roof over their heads, were able to put gas in their tank to get over to get a COVID test because Frances Perkins lived.
Stay with us. Welcome back to American Compassion, the Safety Net podcast. I'm Rebecca McEnroy.
I'm Michael Zapruder. Again, Kirstin Downey.
So this intellectual ferment that was happening in New York, the same thing was happening in a lot of European capitals as well. Beginning in the progressive movement is an organization called the International Labor Organization that was one of the initiatives that was part of the League of Nations proposal, which we later see come fruition in much bigger way as the United Nations. But the League of Nations was something that Woodrow Wilson had proposed. And the International Labor Organization was created in, I think, about 1919. And that's where you see a lot of labor union, compassionate employers, and government advocates coming together to look at ways they can craft new solutions to these old problems. And so, for example, in Germany, they were pioneering new kinds of pension systems. In England, they were talking about new kinds of ways to provide funding to people who were out of work. These ideas were percolating around Europe too, and in a lot of ways were particularly advanced in Germany, which had a very strong labor movement up until the rise of Hitler. And so there were some very exciting things coming out of Germany that they were duplicating. So pretty much what she was doing was picking and choosing from around the world. And even, for example, the concept of unemployment insurance, that had been pioneered in Wisconsin. So part of the reason that the federal program of unemployment insurance has this unusual federal and state configuration is that no one wanted to interfere with the successful program that Wisconsin already had. So they were picking and choosing from a lot of different ideas. And then over 30 years of time, Frances Perkins tried to find ways to take very good ideas from all over the world and put them into an American perspective. The genius of what she did, and part of the reason that we've been able to maintain it all these years, is that much of that social safety network in America, it's work-based. It's not charity-based. You don't get unemployment assistance just because you're poor. You get it because you paid into it when you were working, and an employer paid in a portion while you were working. You get it when you become jobless because you earned it. You get Social Security because you earned it. FDR and Frances Perkins believed that tying benefits to work would be a much more accepted way in America to be able to help a lot more people. And it was also a way to get around some of the legal issues that were raised in trying to create programs like this in the United States. So she was taking innovative ideas and finding ways to adapt them to the American firmament. She corresponded with thousands of people, and her papers have been dumped all over the place in like 10 or 12 archives. There were many, many letters from German Jews thanking her or making a comment about something that she was clearly in correspondence with and had brought to safety in the United States. Some of them were famous musicians, like Baron von Trapp. She would meet people and maintain ties with them over a long period of time. And she also wrote to people she was enemies with. If they had something bad happen to them, an injury, a loss of a family member, she would write these very nice letters So in addition to keeping her friends close, she also had a way of being kind to her enemies, and her correspondence is fascinating.
But it wasn't only in her letters that she was making connections and reaching people who didn't necessarily agree with her at all.
Frances Perkins really prided herself on talking to people who did not agree with her. The eagerness to talk to people on the other side, not only just the willingness, but the eagerness. Frances Perkins said she wouldn't make any headway talking to people who already agreed with her. She had to go out and talk to people who didn't agree with her. So while she was FDR's Secretary of Labor and while he was running for president, she really took it upon herself to be the one to travel all around the South and try to get people who were, at that point, still only marginally Democrat, keep them on board, keep them interested in her issues, be a sympathetic listener to their concerns.
And she was doing all of this while trying to raise a child on her own, with a husband in the hospital struggling with a mental illness, working tirelessly with little help and overwhelming financial insecurity.
She was very private about a lot of the pains and sorrows that she had in her own life, but the work that she does underscores to us how deeply she must have felt these things, and also her unique empathy for others. She had the ability to put herself in other people's shoes to a really remarkable extent. She was religious. She was a frequent visitor to a convent outside of Catonsville, Maryland, where she would observe a vow of silence. She would often go there for 3 days at a time, once a month or so. And while I was researching the book, I met some very old nuns who had been living there as young women when she was there. And they described seeing her on her hands and knees praying at an altar in the middle of the night, and then going back up to her room, and they would see her in the window writing, trying to come up with plans for how to help government programs get established or operate more successfully. So everything that she did was completely informed by her religion. She was very concerned always about the elderly and the plight of the elderly. She was very concerned about mothers, especially mothers trying to raise children alone. She was very interested in health. She was an advocate of national health insurance, and her biggest disappointment was that she was not able to get national health insurance enacted. But you can see all these experiences that she had in her 20s and 30s, in her family and in the world in which she inhabited as a social worker, playing out later in what she tries to get accomplished, to try to find ways to remedy really what are age-old ills.
And all of her work, all of her efforts to build a safety net, to make life better for all Americans, that wasn't in vain. She was the right woman for her time, and maybe for our time.
What she accomplished is really extraordinary. We've talked about fire safety, we've talked about maternity care, we've talked about improved workplace conditions in New York. But as soon as FDR arrived in Washington, D.C. as president, the country was in free fall in the Great Depression. Frances Perkins immediately began putting into effect this set of ideas that she'd been thinking about. She had actually a list of things that she wanted to do. She told FDR she would only become his Secretary of Labor if he would agree to allow her to try to make things happen. And so I'm going to go through with you some of the things that they were. The Social Security Act. It's passed in 1935. It gives us Social Security. And in fact, right now, 69 million people in America are on Social Security. It gave us unemployment insurance. At the height of COVID, we had almost 15% unemployment, and we had 23 million people on unemployment insurance. So add those two things together. Just last year, when we talk about her handiwork, 69 million on Social Security, 23 million on unemployment insurance, 93 million on the two programs that she personally crafted. So more than a third of Americans last year got their bread, kept a roof over their heads, were able to put gas in their tank to get over to get a COVID test because Frances Perkins lived. Now, the next big thing she did was the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that passed in 1938, and that's the thing that led to the creation of the 40-hour work week, minimum wage, ban on child labor, and the concept, really the creation of the concept of overtime pay, that if you work more than 40 hours, you have to be paid extra money for doing it. Another major thing she did in that same period, she was the major supporter within the cabinet for the creation of Federal Housing Administration insurance. That's FHA insurance, which allows people to buy houses with low down payments with the federal government backing that purchase, guaranteeing that purchase. It put people who would have never been able to own homes into homeownership, most of them for the first time in their lives. And it also meant that they got into the kinds of homes that were more safe. These are homes with indoor plumbing. These are homes with running water. That's one of the miracles of the FHA insurance program. Right now, we have 2.5 million people in the United States living in homes thanks to FHA insurance. She was the primary architect of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put 3 million men and women to work, mostly young men, to work building parks and forests, all the infrastructure that we enjoy when we go to parks and forests. A lot of that old infrastructure we'll see was actually built through the Civilian Conservation Corps. She was also the largest single supporter of the Works Progress Administration, which built those massive public works projects. You know, just to give you a few examples, that would be Lincoln Tunnel, the Blue Ridge Parkway, the highway to the Florida Keys, and even the murals that decorate post offices throughout the country are part of either the WPA or another program called the PWA. And then there's, of course, everything she did on the labor front. She helped draft the rule that specifically and for the first time gave workers the right to organize, the National Labor Relations Act. In 1932, when FDR became president, only 5% of America's workers were unionized. That's about half the level of now. But by the time she died, about a third of Americans were unionized. And again, that was yet another thing that lifted millions of people for the first time into the middle class. Those are some of the things I'd highlight.
Yet even with everything she achieved, with all that she built, some still find fault that she didn't do more.
Every single advance that's made, people never get everything they want. There's an intellectual fallacy. It's actually one of the reasons we have such a hard time getting things done, is that the perfect can be the enemy of the good. And so Frances Perkins early on decided that it was better to get something that was better for more people than to try to go for perfection and get nothing for anyone. In fact, one author that's written of that time period has even called her the half-a-loaf girl, that she would take half a loaf rather than no bread at all. The most famous example of this is that when she was a young activist in New York, she got a chance to find a way to get legislation that would reduce the working hours for women and children in factories. And I believe it was to reduce it to 48 hours a week. And this was very controversial. She had to fight very hard for it. And at the last minute, her enemies pulled a trick on her. They had found a way to pull all the cannery workers out of the legislation. And it was very painful for her. And a lot of her allies said, oh, this was such a dirty trick. We have to refuse to go along. We're not going to be covering the women in the canneries. And they're the ones that, during canning season, people were working very long hours. Her friends who were purists said, we have to back out. And another friend called her aside and said, how many people will you cover if you accept what you have, and how many will you exclude? And she looked it over and she said she realized she had the chance to help hundreds of thousands, and that she'd go back the next year and try to get cannery workers next. And that's what she did. That's exactly what she did. And that's what she did with the legislation that they passed during the New Deal. Frances Perkins herself was dissatisfied with the Fair Labor Standards Act. She felt like it was watered down. It wasn't what she wanted. She wanted it to be a living wage, not a minimum wage. But it was, by 1938, it was becoming very difficult to get this kind of progressive legislation passed. The early terror that business owners had felt over the Depression had eased a bit. People were doing better, and there was much more organized pushback to the kinds of progressive legislation she was proposing. So she didn't get everything she wanted. She got less than what she wanted. Domestic workers got excluded. Some agricultural workers got excluded. As it ended up, a lot of minorities and women ended up getting excluded. That's true. But I went back and looked recently, and to the best estimates that I could get, the Fair Labor Standards Act covered about 8 million people at the time, and about 500,000, and these are just estimates, were excluded. So they got a huge expansion, and an expansion that I might add allowed the 500,000 to find jobs that would be covered if they wanted better jobs. It gave them an avenue to prosperity as well. And I think that that work was left undone.
Even though there is much more work to do to build a stronger and more robust American safety net, one that includes everyone, without Frances Perkins, it's certain that we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are today, even with all the imperfections. So why isn't Frances Perkins a household name? Why don't people know about everything she accomplished?
It's very interesting, but even women scholars haven't embraced her in the way that you'd think. It's very strange. When the book first came out, people would ask me the question, and I would talk about a few things that she did that absolutely caused her to be less well known. She didn't go out seeking fame. She would see a problem, try to fix it, get a program in place that would work very well. I mean, think how incredibly effectively Social Security works. She would oversee it being set up, but often she wouldn't get credit for it. Someone else was named to the Social Security Administration. Someone else was named over unemployment insurance. But she would arrange for people to be placed in those jobs who took their responsibility very seriously and who made these programs work. To her, it wasn't enough to invent a program. It had to be a program that worked. She was very interested in setting things up properly. And in a lot of ways, FDR took all the credit for himself. He sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Presidents do that. They want everything that happens to be their success, and that's what happened. The other thing that happened to Frances Perkins was, for a long time, history has been dominated by the great man theory. So we had Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or FDR lionized for many decades, and then only later do people come around and talk about the problems, the mistakes, the evil, but we get a balanced picture. At the time Frances Perkins would have come to public light and her significance highlighted, it was in the 1980s when we were first starting to have more feminist history, and we were moving out of the great man or great woman era, and we were talking about how social movements cause changes. So it's been much more common in the last 40 years for people to write about how the textile workers at Raleigh, Durham organized their plant, not how what happened in Washington allowed them to even get that done. And then there's another problem, which was that she was opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment. And that has made her a very uncomfortable woman for feminists and feminist historians. From her perspective, her early and most important successes were that she'd gotten protections for women and children because they needed protection, because they were mothers, because they were our future workforce. She got protections enacted because they were women and children, and she was terrified that the Equal Rights Amendment would cause women and children to be stripped of benefits and protections they vitally need in pursuit of an ideal that men and women will get equal. She thought women did need certain kinds of particular protections. But that made a lot of women in recent decades hostile to Frances Perkins. But then as time has gone by, I really think a lot more of this is misogynist. As each generation passes, the contributions of women get dropped away. And after I wrote my book about Frances Perkins, I wrote a book about Queen Isabella of Castile, who was a very remarkable queen of Spain and sent Christopher Columbus out and unified Spain and built the foundation that made Spain a global superpower for 300 years. But when I went to look her up, a lot of times in encyclopedias and in directories, she would be called Isabella, consort of Ferdinand. And I realized there's a very deeply ingrained difficulty acknowledging the role and the importance of things women have done over history. I think Frances Perkins is an extreme example, but just having looked closely at these two women's lives, I just wonder how many other really great women were out there that did phenomenal things that have similarly been written out of history.
Coming up on the next episode of American Compassion.
The New Deal would have never happened if capitalism hadn't staged its greatest catastrophic failure in the fall of 1929.
FDR was entering a moment of struggle, insurgency, anger.
At that time, dictatorship was a compliment.
American Compassion, the Safety Net podcast, is produced in Austin, Texas, with support from Findhelp.org. Michael Zapruder composed and arranged the music for this show, and it was recorded live at KUT Studios in Austin, Texas, with Brandon Temple on drums, Sam Littman piano, Rick White on trumpet, and John Lundbahn on banjo, and engineered by Jake Perlman and Renee Chavez.
Special thanks to our guests for this episode, H.W. Brands and Kirstin Downey. And thank you to Cornell University for the use of archived materials. Rebecca McEnroy is our executive producer. And for American Compassion, I'm Michael Zapruder. Thanks for listening.